Hi, everybody. Welcome to another preview for our Sunday school class on the book of Philippians. And this week we're going to be looking at chapter 2, verses 1 to 4. Last time we saw how Paul used civil and military allusions to get the Philippians to think differently about themselves as a way of bringing together kind of a unified idea of who they were as a church with a common mission. This time, now, or Paul continues, I should say. Paul will be using sort of a persuasive argumentation as a form of rhetoric. Paul is making an appeal to the Philippians to be unified in the calling that God has issued for them, and he uses persuasive words to achieve that goal. So let's look at the passage here. So we read, Paul writes, "If there is any encouragement in Christ, any comfort from love, any participation in the Spirit, any affection and sympathy, complete my joy by being of the same mind, having the same love, being in full accord and of one mind. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interest, but also to the interest of others." Paul begins here, like we said, with a command. Now, Paul could have simply commanded the church to be unified. He could have said, hey, get yourselves put together and stay as one. But notice that in these first two verses, what is actually commanded? What's the main sort of clause of this sentence? What's the meat, you might say, of the command of what's being said here? And at the heart of it, it's a simple statement: make my joy complete. If we're to diagram it, that's what it would be. Now, think about how significant or different that would be or is if we compared it to if Paul were simply to say, be unified. And he could have said that. But Paul is making this very personal. He's saying, Philippians, my joy is completed in your unity. So this is a master stroke of rhetoric. And he sets it up as something of an logical argument. It's kind of in the form of an if-then statement. If this is the case, then you should do this. The preconditions that he provides the Philippians are painfully obvious. And so he writes, if there is any encouragement in Christ, any comfort from love, any participation in the Spirit, any affection and sympathy. And now we can see right away that these are pretty much softballs that he's pitching to them. Is there any encouragement in Christ? Well, clearly there is. Is there any participation in the Spirit? Yes. Is there any affection and sympathy in Christ? You know that there is. Paul, completing this joy that Paul wants them to do flows naturally from these provisions of grace that to them, to his audience, should be obvious. These things that we have in Christ are clearly true. But if they are true, then it moves into something else. And then it should move into completing Paul's joy. And then Paul then moves into just showing us how his joy is made complete. And he shows it with a rather, important list here. He says, being of the same mind, having the same love, being in full accord and of one mind, doing nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, in humility, counting others more significant than yourselves, looking not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. So there's this list of participles that sort of define or modify what does it mean to complete Paul's joy. As we see in verse 2, at the second half of verse 2, where he begins by saying, be of the same mind, and then he ends by saying, be of the same mind in verse 2. And wrapped around that is love. And the idea here of being of the same mind is not so much having the same opinions, but it's having a common purpose, a common aim, a common goal, something that we can all sort of focus in upon. And of course, at the heart of that is love. Since the unity of purpose or aim is rooted in Jesus Christ, it is characterized by love. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. It is the love of God that has been poured out into our hearts in Christ Jesus. Love characterizes both the actions of God in his work of redemption, and it is the principal virtue that emerges from the heart transformed by the gospel. We are bound together in Christ by the same love, by the love of God for us in Christ Jesus. The love that binds us together is the same love that is given to us to share and receive from one another. This binding love sends us forth to our neighbors in our calling to be salt and light in the world. Then in verse 3, Paul sets up a contrast. Making his joy complete means for the Philippians to be doing nothing from selfish ambition or conceit. The word there for selfish ambition really means rivalry. Paul tells the Philippians to do nothing from selfish ambition. Don't set yourself up as rivals to one another. Don't try to outdo one another and look better in the eyes of others. We need to keep in mind that the first century Mediterranean culture, was driven very much by an honor and shame impulse. To be able to stand above your neighbors and to become the envy of others was the pattern of life that you sought to live. It was what it meant to live a life well. Nothing was worse than bearing shame and reproach by those around you. Paul's gospel was injected with a completely countercultural ethic. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. The humiliation of the cross was at the same time the glory of God in Jesus Christ and a sign of God's triumph over sin and death. These weren't just words to use in a slogan. This was a new and revolutionary way of seeing the world for what it really is and living in accordance with that reality. Paul's joy is for them to throw off the old patterns and habits of behavior that had shaped them and to enter into the reality of God's grace, and from that grace find the new pattern of life that is shaped by love. We learn these patterns of living selfishly from childhood. Now that the Philippians have been born anew, and likewise they must now learn to live in a new way. So rather than conceit and rivalry, they are to adopt the pattern of humility, counting others as more important than yourselves, looking not to your own interest, but to the interest of others. This is the pattern of life into which the gospel calls them. It's new, it's strange, it's unlike everything they've been taught before. And like us, they stumble and fall. They try and they fail, but there's no going back to the old ways. There is only the new that exists now. Remember the children of Israel when they were sent out from Egypt with Moses. They'd been set free from slavery. They were no longer to live as slaves as though they were under the heavy burden of Pharaoh. But this new life posed challenges for them as well. They grumbled and complained. At one point, they even suggested that perhaps they should go back to Egypt. At least they could eat leeks and onions, right? But back there was death and slavery from which they had been saved. Israel's story is there for us to see that, like them, we too have been set free in the gospel of Christ. But like them, the manner of life that we are to live now can be difficult. We can be tempted to want to live according to the pattern of this world, to live as though the grace of God means nothing to us. But there is nothing for us to turn back to even though we are tempted. Paul will be setting before them in the next few verses what we'll take up next week as a pattern of life that they are to follow. This is the pattern of the life of Jesus Christ himself. The wonderful secret of making Paul's joy complete is that for the Philippians and for us, it is the way by which we in Christ complete our joy as well. God is calling us into community that we might worship and give him glory. God has called us into community in order for us to love and to serve one another in faith. And in this calling, we can also see that God has given us community that by this worship and service, we too may begin to learn what it means to live in a manner worthy of the citizenship that we now hold in Christ. Well, thanks for listening, and I'm looking forward to seeing you this Sunday.